Thank you. Can you all hear me? Okay. Thank you, Brad Gilliland, for inviting me to this meeting of the Medical Illustration Regional Area, and I appreciate the invitation greatly. I wanted to start by introducing my motivations for making the type of work that I've made over the years. And ordinarily, I work on figure work and I work on still lives simultaneously. But today, I just wanted to focus on the body of work that deals mostly with this particular impulse of mine. And the title, View from Above, stems from my experience growing up in this particular family. So I am the youngest of 6 daughters, so that's me on the very end. And in terms of what it was like to grow up as the youngest in this large group is that I never got a word in edgewise. But what it was like was being constantly watching a play. So I felt like I was in the audience. I was up in the cheap seats watching the marvelous drama unfold. So that's why the view from above is I always felt a little bit removed, as if I was watching the drama unfold. And then my parents had this bizarre notion that we all needed to constantly line up. And so I always knew where the pecking order was, and you can see that I'm not necessarily really thrilled with this, but again, there's this sense of kind of community with my sisters, and if that's not enough, it keeps going. But my father was also a university professor, and he was a professor of hydrometallurgical engineering and was invited to begin a graduate program at the University of the Philippines. So when I was very, very young, I was 8 years old, he packed up all of us and took us to the Philippines to live overseas for 2 years. And we even took the family dog. But before I launch into that, this is another very important impulse that was a part of our family tradition. Going to, every week, the movies, the outdoor movies. And before we went to the movie, we went to the drugstore and we found the most decadent candy. My father had such a sweet tooth, an incredible sweet tooth. And so I early on learned to equate complete and utter joy to sweets. And that to me was the equivalent. And not only did he love candy, but he loved ice cream. And so this was another little Mecca trip that he would take all of us to. And believe it or not, that ice cream cone spins around on this sign. It's still there, even though it was there when I was a little girl in the 1960s. And so this love affair with sweets and sticky, gooey, drippy deliciousness. So here we are. This is the age I was. I was 8 years old when my parents took us all over to live in the Philippines. So here I am again watching from the cheap seats. And this is my vantage point of being plopped in the middle of this incredible experience. And while we were there, my father made sure we went everywhere. He would plan these meticulous itineraries. It was amazing. What we were able to see in those 2 years just boggles the mind. So he took us throughout all of Southeast Asia. And since this was the 1960s, it was cheap to travel. And then we did another big sweep up through Europe, and we did a sweep up through Scandinavia. And he just showed us the world because he felt like it was his job to make sure that we had that kind of education. So here, my sisters and I are tromping across Bangkok, and it's the hottest day ever on the planet. I just remember being absolutely drenched. And, you know, the National Gallery, seeing this when I was 8 years old, going to the National Gallery and to the Louvre when I was 9 and 10, and repeatedly going back and seeing these sites. So I was looking at this type of work as a young child, and I remember just going up to these paintings and looking at those little grapes, and sometimes there'd be like little drops of water on it, and it's like, I gotta figure out how to do that. That's amazing. So I loved the idea of translucency, transparencies, the idea of sublime beauty, not just pretty, but just really sublime, almost to the point of the beauty being, to the point of almost being painful to see because it was so elegant. So these gorgeous renderings of flowers from these Dutch paintings that were just so transcendent. And food, I mean, who couldn't relate to that? But again, metal and food and the different textures and ceramics, and trying to capture the essence of the textures of all of these objects became really fascinating to me. So these are some of the earliest still lifes that I did. This probably dates back to the 1980s, 1990s. And I was setting up these still lifes and painting from life. And I found it really intriguing that people would say, oh, you're a photorealist. It's like, well, no, there wasn't a camera involved. It was my eye and the object, and then me taking what I was seeing and transferring that onto a surface. And so I used to get kind of upset about that. It's like, no, I'm not a photorealist. I'm a realist. Well, I got to the point where my eyes are not as good. And then I started painting some objects that were so small I couldn't see them with the naked eye. So I had to photograph them. And by photographing them, I learned that I could use the camera in a way that I wasn't necessarily wedded to the lens. That the camera instead, and the photograph became an aid to helping me to see the object. But it wasn't my master. It was just a tool for helping me get where I wanted to go. And I found that I still needed to have the actual object in my studio with me, because I realized that the camera lies. It tells me the wrong colors. It doesn't give me the right textures. It gives me some information, but the rest of the information can only come, as far as I'm concerned, by looking at the object in front of me and really understanding and analyzing the three-dimensional elements of the objects. So all of these were done strictly from life. But as you can see, I'm thinking about these types of textures that I was seeing as a young child looking at these Northern European Dutch paintings. So glass, transparency, I call it bling. Love things that are shiny, transparent, metal, anything that I can really kind of dig down and analyze. I guess that's kind of my father's scientific impulse, that level of analysis. I also really was intrigued by the idea of these altarpieces. So I did a lot of woodworking and figured out how to get these little side panels to open and close. And so I really enjoyed that element. Now, around this time period, my gallerist in New York had the opportunity to speak with the people at this grocery store that's on the corner of Broome and, I think it was Wooster at the time, Broome and Wooster. And he said to the owners of the Gourmet Garage, I would like to build these little window boxes, little gallery displays, and light them and have the artists in my stable make work just for the gallery or for these store windows, because gazillions of people walk by them every day. So it's really a beautiful venue to show work at. So I did do a series of paintings for the windows, and they liked them so much they wanted paintings for inside. So I ended up painting this long mural above the register as you walk into this Gourmet Garage. It's still there in Soho. So if you walk in, you can see this big expanse. And it was the first time I ever painted this big. So everything up until that point had been, like this big. And then I thought, that was really fun. I love painting oranges that were like this and shrimp that were like this. And I thought, that's just almost too fun. So after this point, I thought, I'm I'm going to paint a bunch of stuff that ordinarily you can just fit in your hand, but I'm going to paint it big. And so that led to this series, and it was entitled Larger Than Life. And it was so much fun. Oh my gosh, I go to the grocery store and it's like, I want to paint you. And so I just buy all this candy and put it in my bag, and you should have seen the looks that people gave me as I was checking out. It's like, you've got a heck of a sweet tooth. So, you know, I was looking for objects that looked gorgeous under light. So I'm very much about stage lighting, a Caravaggio-esque kind of sexy light, so that you just see this color that's passing through, and the cast shadow was just so gorgeous. So I fell in love with staging these. And when I stage a still life, I oftentimes will take somewhere around maybe 100 to 200 images of the setup. So I actually made these first time ever. I just knew I wanted to paint candied apples, but I didn't know what the heck I was doing. And so the one in the middle, I was just like glopping it on and couldn't really figure it out. But I ended up really loving it the most. It was a happy accident. So it became kind of the main player in this. So here I've got all these candied apples. I set them up. I take from this angle. I take from an angle from down below looking up. I do, you know, the eye level. I move them around. I move the light around. And so I'm maybe coming up with around like 150 to 200 images. And then I go through them quickly. You know, on my computer, I'm just tap, 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 and it's like, boom, you're the one. And it has to just stand right out at me. And that actually takes a long time for me to come up with exactly what I want to choreograph as my painting. And then this was so much fun to do because of the transparency and the reflected light and the reflection of the cast shadow. And then this was also so much fun to paint. I realized, though, that I couldn't mix that color purple. And so I had to go over to the loft with my lollipop. And I'm holding it like this and looking at all the oil paints and trying to find the exact right color, because as you know, if you try to mix a purple in oil paint, it doesn't quite, you can't, it's muddy. And so I had to get just the right purple. And, you know, these, again, really fun to paint. This gives you an idea of the scale of the painting. So this is my gallerist, John Woodward, and he's standing in the corner so you can see how big these paintings are. And oh, they were so fun to do. Matter of fact, that whole series, Larger Than Life, was so fun that I thought, well, I don't necessarily want to be called the Candy Girl, so what more can I paint? And I thought, I'll paint toys because they're colorful and they have shiny, glossy surfaces. And so this one was another large-scale painting. This one's called Sweet Nothings. And wax lips. So I went back to that time period where my father was dragging us to the drugstore to get our candy, and I found candy that resonated with me from the 1960s, and of course those wax lips. Also thinking back on the Dutch, those still lives with all the flowers, and just wanting to see if I could capture that sense of transparency of the petals, and analyze the intricacy of how these flowers are put together. And this one here too, Lily. And then I've also, over the years, done a lot of figure work. And so I found myself, after doing all these still lifes, I was starting to kind of get homesick. I wanted to do some figures. So these are the 3 monkeys. And then I realized that a lot of the toys that I was starting to paint were also kind of figurally based and a little bit more of a narrative in telling a story. So this one's called Surrender. And for those of you who grew up with Barbie dolls, we weren't just changing their clothes. And I thought, okay, what toys were as fun to paint as great big jawbreakers? And I thought marbles. Marbles are so beautiful. And so I must have taken about 500 pictures of marbles because they're so amazingly beautiful. And I really loved what was happening with the depth of field in the photograph, so I did try to match that idea, that sense of depth of field. This painting ended up being in the ambassador's residence in Tel Aviv for several years, and it became the backdrop for several dignitaries. So I was very honored that it became their backdrop. So this is Justice Kagan in Tel Aviv. And then I have 4 children, and when they were growing up in the 1980s, I became really interested in how they interact during their playtime with their toys. And so I went back and had to repurchase all the toys that they had when they were little because I'd given them away. But this was one toy that they had that I thought, what designer made this for little children? Because it's just creepy. And so this painting is entitled Menace. This one is Troika, because being a Cold War baby, this maybe has more meaning for those of you who grew up during the Cold War era. So this is Troika. And I loved how you could use toys to create these different dynamics and narratives. So this is encounter number 1. Encounter number 2. And Ophelia. Then I was asked again to paint more paintings for the Gourmet Garage windows. My dealer was saying, why don't you paint like donuts or cookies? And it's like, well, that's boring. I want to paint something really sexy, like this. So something shiny and gooey and drippy and beautiful. And so I, again, was painting food. And this was my first attempt at ice cream. And I realized that ice cream melts really fast. Another great impulse and that has led to a direction in my life is teaching for the Cortona program. So UGA has a study abroad program in Cortona, Italy, and this is a picture of downtown Cortona. And in reference to my father's love of traveling, I took my 4 children to Cortona on multiple occasions, and so they have been a part of the richness of travel as well. While I was there, I happened to go to the next little town over called Arezzo, and there they had an antique market out, and it was mind-blowing, because while I was there, there were tables full of the most beautiful antiques. So I walked by one table that looked like this. And it was just this landscape of sterling silver. So you can imagine me, I was in heaven. So I got out my cell phone, and this Italian vendor is watching me like, what's she gonna do next? And I'm walking all around this and taking a gazillion pictures. And then I got home and decided I was going to paint this really big. So this painting is 6 feet high and 8 feet wide. And I decided I was just going to go full bore into it. Now, the first thing I painted was the cat, because I thought, the cat has a face. I understand faces. I'm going to paint it first. Oh, man. Then I realized I'd gotten myself into hot water, so I thought, okay, I'm going to abandon that. And then I'm going to start down with these guys. So I started here, went up that way, came back around here, and then ended up with the cat again. And then I realized that after I'd painted all the objects around the cat, I recognized what I was looking at because they're all reflected in the back of the cat. It's like, oh, now I get it. It was all about analyzing the forms. So it's not enough to just look at the photograph. It's all about kind of analytically figuring out what it was that I was looking at. And interestingly, I kept seeing myself again and again. So here I am, right here, holding out my cell phone. Here I am here, upside down. I'm here. I'm over there. And I realized that I'm up there in that. And so there are all these little reflections, and not only me, but the building across the street. And so all the yellows that you see in there are actually Italian buildings. And so it was really fun because as I was painting it, I wasn't even thinking what it was that I was seeing, because, you know, one of these pots is like this big. And so up close, it looked very abstract. And then as I would work in my studio, I'd take a step back and I'd be like, boom. It would just come into focus and it would be like, that's what that is. But as I was painting on that scale, sometimes I didn't even recognize what it was that I was painting. All right, so this one's called Atomic Number 47. And this is a close-up. You can see the cat in there. And another close-up. Now, unfortunately, what doesn't come across in my paintings is that I do like the surfaces to look painterly. And so if you look at the paintings in person, you'll see a buildup of the paint on the surface. It just doesn't really translate into a digital format. And then this is a sister piece. It's also 8 feet by 6 feet. And this was, you know, in that same street, you went from the sterling silver and you turned this way, and it was the ceramic table. And so this was another fun one to paint. And to give you an idea of how this, not necessarily photorealism, is, you can see that I did not get in there really tightly and get all the little faces in there. As a matter of fact, I probably left out about 50% of the information that was in the photograph. I had to pick and choose what went in. I wasn't a slave to the photograph. I really had to make a lot of curatorial decisions on what went in and what stayed out. All right, and then this is, I put myself in for scale so you can see how big this painting is. And then it was on display in the gallery up in New York City. And at the same time period, I was contacted by the Maria V. Howard Art Center in North Carolina, just outside of Raleigh-Durham, and they asked me to do a retrospective show plus new work for a solo exhibition last year. And I was very honored and very excited about this, but it was very daunting because they wanted to have 32 pieces. So I was like, yikes, that's a lot of painting, because I had about 20 pieces, so I had to make a bunch of new ones. And so I went into high gear and started painting more stuff. And the title of the exhibition was Sweet Surrender. So tapped into my dad again and just started looking for all kinds of sweets. These are gorgeous, but have you ever been to one of these candy buffets? This stuff is terrible. Believe me, I tried every single one of them, and they were not very good, but they look beautiful. And then me photographing ice cream, it gets dicey fast. So there was a lot of ice cream that got thrown out as I was working. And little cake pops were really fun to paint. And this was, this was out of frustration, because I had intended to do this really beautiful, you know, gorgeous display with 3 different colors of ice cream, toppings on them, with the cherries on the top, you know, and pretty whipped cream. No, it didn't go that way. Because as soon as because I love the light, right? So I've got this hot light on this, and I had it staged just right, put the whipping cream on, stick the cherry on, got behind the camera, and the cherry would go thump. So I'd do it again, and then I'd throw that ice cream out and put more on, and finally I embraced it. And it's like, okay, we're going all out here. So I was just squeezing everything I could find, and it just made this big flow across the table. And I thought, that's what I want to paint. So this one's called Full Steam Ahead. And this one is Cascade, because that whipping cream was on the top, but it cascaded down the side. And then Gigi's Cupcakes. Yeah, I would paint this and my daughter would come in and say, "Are you finished yet?" Condor Chocolates. And then this is an installation shot, so you can see it was a really beautiful space, and it gives you an idea of the scale of a lot of these paintings. It's hard to tell when you're just seeing a single digital of them. So here they are installed. And I wanted to take this time to thank my father, who hauled me all over the world, who made sure that my life was full of love and abundance and great experiences. And the best that I can do to honor both of my parents is to do the same for my 4 children. And so my life has been full of great experiences and lots of a circle of love. And that's what I find to be ultimately sublime and ultimately satisfying as I walk into my studio and think, what's the next thing that I want to paint? And thank you so much. Are there any questions?